Jessica Gottlieb. Is it Gottlieb?
Gottlieb, yeah.
Yes. Okay. I always gotta check. She is from the College of Education. She's in the Department of Educational Psychology and Leadership. And we've been collaborating ever since she got here a few years ago because she's awesome. And as somebody in STEM, I need somebody in education to make my grants look a lot better and be successful, which we did. We've got one funded together. So we're excited that she's going to talk to us in general, right, about STEM education research topics. It's meant to be sort of for people who want to sort of get into this, right? Yeah. And the different aspects and ways you can come at it. I know there's several College of Education folks in the room too. So if you're a STEM person and you're looking for to either get into this area or write some grants, we've got people in the room that you can partner with. And apparently we're very unique at Texas Tech in that we do that, because you leave here and you talk to other people and they're like, what do you mean you collaborate with people from your College of Education? They look at us kind of strange. They're like, how do you do that? They want to know the secret. And basically it's you talk to people, and then maybe something like this, you have them give a seminar and invite STEM folks along. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Beth. Yes, sure.
I don't want to miss the class, the lecture. I don't want to miss my lunch.
Oh, please
So
eat.
can I eat?
Yeah, you can eat wherever you would like.
You can sit there and eat.
Oh, yeah, you can sit there and eat.
I don't want to bother others.
Don't feel like you need to hide.
I bother you guys. I will eat here then.
All right, so I want to start by thanking Jacqueline for that introduction, and by prefacing everything by just saying I want this to be very informal. So if you have questions, stop me. If I'm going too fast, stop me. I will let you know that I have a toddler who likes to be up at night, and I've had a lot of coffee today, so who knows. So just to give you some really quick background on me and how I approach this work. My research and a lot of my teaching is in educational policy, so I'm really interested in how we use policy to get students to enter STEM fields, right? Particularly historically underrepresented groups of students. And I came to that research interest both through scholarly interest, but also through a personal one. So my undergraduate degree is in aerospace engineering. I taught math at a very high-need school in South Los Angeles. So I've always kind of had this interest in math and science, and now a lot of my research is trying to understand how we can support students and faculty and teachers in creating opportunities for students in STEM. So that's just kind of my background. If you had a chance, you can send an anonymous question if you would like. If there's time at the end, I thought we could look at some of your topics that you're interested in and maybe talk a little bit about how we might apply some of the things we're going to talk about. Or look for those opportunities for collaboration like Jacqueline was talking about. We also have some other STEM education researchers in here, so you all should feel free to jump in anytime I misspeak or clarify or augment what I'm saying. So Jessica asked me to come and speak about theory and research in STEM education, and I said, sure, why not? November seems very far away from when she asked me to do it, so I agreed to. So what I'm going to try and do in this presentation is give you basically a crash course in how to do research in STEM education for those of you who are STEM faculty members, and also introduce some of the really useful theories in STEM education research that you can use to possibly begin to structure some of your inquiry. So the idea is not to download a STEM education doctorate to you in the next 50 minutes, or even to show you how to do all of this. It's really just to seed some ideas so that when you do go talk to an education researcher, you maybe have a little bit better idea of what they can what they can bring to your work and what you might bring to their work. So consider this just matchmaking. So there's things are going wild. All right. Okay, so here's our agenda. So I thought we could start by just, I'll share some really common STEM education research questions and topics that I come across a lot, both in the literature and in my work with different people here at Tech. We'll talk about the difference between evaluation and research, because that really justifies why we need to use theory in our research, right? So why should you care about all the theories I'm going to tell you about? We'll give you a very high-level overview of some of the methodological approaches we use in education research. And we'll talk about theories, and we'll spend the bulk of our time really looking at specific theories that you can use in STEM education research. This is not exhaustive, and I'm not an authority on really any of these things, but I do know a little bit enough to convince you to listen to me for an hour. And I'm gonna leave a lot of time at the end for questions. All right, so really common STEM education research questions. So I wrote some that I see a lot, right? Are students interested in STEM? Are students interested in math? Do they like engineering? I tried something in my class. Are my students more motivated? Are they less motivated? Why are they motivated? Do students see themselves as scientists or engineers, right? You know, did my intervention make my students want to go into STEM jobs more? Or maybe less, who knows? Or, you know, what factors might be related to wanting to go into STEM? The thread through all of these questions is that these are not questions about learning or assessment, okay? So in the education world, that is a different thing than these types of questions. So we're not going to talk about how to measure learning. I'm not a psychometrician. You know, we're not going to talk about how to know whether or not your students are learning. We're going to talk about some of the other outcomes that we care about as well, right? So things like, you know, interest, identity, efficacy, you know, do they even want to come to class anymore? Those types of questions. So when we approach this work, and I'm gonna kind of assume that everyone here has a little bit of grant writing experience, right? You write your grant and there's an evaluation section and there's a research section, and they're always different. And sometimes people don't really understand why or don't really have a strong grasp of what the difference is. So we consider evaluation to be like, did it work? Like I did something with my students, did it work? Did they learn more? Did they, you know, did the thing that happened that I thought would happen, right? You know, did you do what you said you would do, right? This is very common in grant evaluation. You said that you would have a monthly STEM club meeting. Did that actually happen? How can you show someone that, right? And it can be any kind of methodology. You know, you can talk to people, you can survey them, you can look at grades, you can look at test scores. But this is evaluation, and this is a completely legitimate, worthwhile endeavor, right? I'm not denigrating it at all, but it is different than research. So in the education world, the thing that distinguishes evaluation from research is the use of theory. So if you just want to know if something works, that's kind of an atheoretical question, right? Like, it did or didn't do something. That thing might have been good or bad, who knows? In research, we're using theory or other empirical research to inform what we're trying to study, right? So I'm not just asking, did it work? I'm saying, did that student's motivation go up or down based on this theory of how motivation works, right? Did the student become more likely to want to be a scientist based on this theory of career choice, right? So it's different. We connect to the field via theory. So if you, and I apologize, this is a little bit of a diatribe, but I have this conversation with my graduate students all the time. If you're not using theory in education research, you're working in isolation, right? People in the field are just gonna be like, you studied a STEM club in Lubbock, good job, but it doesn't connect to the broader field. So that's very important in this kind of research. This is also something, if you've ever gotten an NSF review that criticized your theoretical framework, this is why. So that's a really common piece of feedback that we get all the time in these things. And this can also have a variety of methodologies, right? So this can be surveys, it can be big data, it can be interviews, it can be ethnography, it can be whatever you want, right? There's a variety of methodologies. And often the data with research and evaluation is actually the same data. So like Jacqueline and I just have a IU's proposal with a lot of people in this room actually that's being reviewed as we speak. Good thoughts. The data we're collecting is actually very similar, but what the evaluator is going to do it and what the research team are going to do with it are different. The evaluator is just looking, you know, did you do what you said you would do, right? Did scores go up? Did scores go down? Did DFW rates go up or down? The research team is going to take a theory that we built into the grant proposal and do other stuff with the very same data. So it's weird because it's like you collect it all together and then you kind of run away to your different corners and do different things. All right, so before we go into the theories, I want to give like a very high level overview of just education research in general. I wasn't totally sure kind of prior knowledge, you know, how familiar people are with like all the terms I'm going to use. So I'm just going to define some stuff. And we have like qualitative and quantitative experts in here. So, you know, feel free to chime in. All right, so qualitative research is one branch of education research. This is often a very good choice if you have a smaller sample size. If you are doing a study with a seminar of 10 people, you're not going to be able to do a lot of statistical things, right? You can like count them, right? That's cool. But it's often not as robust as you might like it to be. So qualitative is great if you're working with a smaller sample size. Qualitative is also really great if you want to go very deep in something, right? So if you really want to know why this group of girls doesn't want to be engineers, you should ask them, right? Like you should go talk to them and try and understand their experiences, right? And why they feel that way. So this is great for going very in depth with something. This is also really important. A lot of the research in STEM education focuses on groups that have been historically underrepresented and underserved, right? By universities, by K-12 systems. And it is really important that their voices come through in the research, okay? They are not lab rats, right? It is really important that we ask students, what is it like to be a student at this university? What was it like to be the only girl in your engineering class, right? So this is where qualitative research is really excellent. And this can be interviews, it can be observations, it can be anything that, really almost anything that you want it to be, but it's really focused on understanding the perspectives of the participants, right? So journals, interviews, observations, those types of things. In contrast, there's quantitative research, right? So this is really great with larger samples. If you have 1,000 students, now you really can do cool statistical things, right? And so this is great. So this is anything that's number crunching, right? Statistics is quantitative. If you're someone that really wants to see statistical significance in your results, you want to see p-values and models and equations, quantitative research is definitely something that's going to make your heart sing. Quantitative research is excellent at looking for relationships between variables, right? So maybe you want to look at whether or not test scores and height are correlated, right? That's a great quantitative question. You don't need to go to talk to someone to answer that, right? You just need to measure everyone, look at their test scores, calculate a correlation. This is also really helpful if you want to look for statistically significant differences between groups, right? And again, I've just given you like 2 semesters of quantitative methods, but you know, that's fine. So basically what I want you to take away from this is qualitative is like talking to people, asking them to write things. Quantitative is when you start doing statistics. Could be surveys, could be institutional data, you know, you're looking at test scores, anything like that. Okay, this is where I really am going to start ranting. There is a branch of quantitative methods called quasi-experimental. So in the social sciences, it's really hard to do a randomized trial. You can, right, but it's really hard for a lot of reasons that I'm happy to talk to you about later. If you think you want to do something that is quasi-experimental, which is doing lots of fun statistical things to pretend like we did a controlled trial when we really didn't, phone a friend. Call someone in the College of Education or a psychologist or someone like that, because there's a lot of like complicated statistical things that would be hard to figure out by Googling. And I have tried. Right. This is the actual rant for this part of the presentation. When you're doing this kind of research, you are not going to prove anything, okay? Social scientists do not like to prove things. It freaks them out, it makes them upset. So you want to be really, really careful about making causal claims, right? So if you do a survey in your class, for example, and you find that 2 constructs are significantly correlated, height and test scores, doesn't mean height causes test scores to go up. Doesn't mean test scores make you get good grades. There's no causality unless you do something quasi-experimental or you do a controlled trial, in which case call your friendly neighborhood like psychologist, you can call me, like, just be really careful with that. It just makes me crazy. All right, last branch of methodology is mixed. All right, so we've got our qualitative folks, we've got our quantitative folks. Sometimes you want to do both. And that can be the best of both worlds. It's really cool to do a survey and then go talk to people as a follow-up, right? It tells you 2 different things. It might be twice as much work, right? So you want to be really careful. You don't want to be like, yes, I'm going to survey my class of 300, and I'm going to interview everyone, and it's going to be great, because you won't ever actually do that. And that is the same conversation I have with my graduate students all the time, when they're like, you know, I'm going to do a mixed methods dissertation. I'm like, well, do you want to finish one, or do you want to mixed methods one? Have one or the other. And you want to make sure you're justifying this. So again, more is not better, right? If you have a question that you can answer by doing a survey and crunching some numbers, that's fine. If you have a question that just needs you to interview some people, that's great too, right? There's no, like, let's say, going back to our example, if you want to know why that group of girls doesn't want to be engineers, you don't need to survey everyone in your class, right? That's extra. It's not aligned with your research question. So it's fine. So those are kind of your methodological flavors. That's about 2 years of graduate school. So we'll just move on from that. All right, so now we're gonna get into the meat of the presentation. So what I want to do here is I want to share with you 3 theories, so educational and psychological theories, that might be useful as you think about some of the STEM education research you might want to do, okay? So this is kind of an overview. This is not exhaustive. I did put the citations in here, and I'm happy to share it with Jessica, or Jessica can share it with everyone so you guys don't have to look it all up. But it's just 3 theories that I've come across with a lot, that I've used in NSF or NIH grants, and that I think are helpful. So the first theory that I see a lot in STEM education is self-determination theory. Okay, so many people want to know about motivation when they study STEM education, right? They want to understand why students are motivated to major in STEM, what motivates them to persist through, you know, an engineering degree, right? Like, believe me, I was the only girl at the sorority house in the lab 20 hours a week, right? What motivates someone to do that? But motivation is really hard to measure, right? Josh is like nodding aggressively. Right? It's really hard, because you can't, someone could do things that suggest motivation, but maybe they don't think they're motivated inside, right? Someone could go to class, take notes, do all of that, but you find out that's because, you know, they're, going to lose their scholarship if they don't get an A, right? They're motivated, but maybe not a good kind of motivation, right? They're afraid, right? Or maybe someone feels very motivated in their head, but they don't actually enact motivated behaviors, right? So motivation is actually kind of a tricky concept. There's lots of kinds of motivation. You can have extrinsically motivated people, right? Like bribery, right? My toddler is motivated to take a bath because then she gets a cookie, right? Intrinsic motivation is obviously internal motivation, right? And that's the kind of motivation we would hope people have in our classes, right? But, you know, who knows? So this is a theory. Ryan and DC identified 3 basic psychological needs that are linked to motivation. So the idea is if you have these 3 things in high levels, you're probably more likely to be motivated. And you're going to have more regulated behavior, right? So you're going to be more in control of what you're doing. You're going to be motivated. These are all good things. So those things are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So autonomy is the sense that you have control, right? You have control over your actions. You're an autonomous person. Competence is the idea that you're good at something, like you're good at what you're trying to do. And relatedness is a feeling that you are connected. So this is actually the theory that we use in our recent IU's grant. So we looked at, well, how do we increase Hispanic students' persistence and achievement in STEM? And we said, okay, well, if we want them to be more motivated, we want to have activities that build their autonomy, okay? We want to have activities that build their competence, and we want to have activities that make them feel connected to one another and to Texas Tech, right? In theory, that will make them more motivated, right? So looking at this, if you were to apply this to a study, those would be the things that you would want to measure, right? So you wouldn't try and measure motivation, right? That's kind of a latent construct, but you would try and measure, do you feel like you have autonomy, right? When you go to class, do you feel like you're basically in control, you know what you should be doing, or do you feel like you're just kind of, you know, floating along? Do you feel confident in class, right? Or do you kind of sit there and just feel like an absolute failure? And do you feel related? Like, do you feel like you know your TA? Do you feel like you know someone in class? Do you feel like you're kind of related to the discipline? And so those would be things you can measure, and there are a ton of survey instruments that measure those exact things, right? So that would take you towards like a quantitative study. Can you think about anything else? Yeah. So this is a theory that I tend to see used in large-scale quantitative studies. So when I say large-scale, I'm talking about hundreds of people, not tens of people. I think that's like a good rule of thumb. I can't give you the exact number, right? I can't say 500 people is enough, because it depends, right? It depends on a lot of different things, all right?
Quantitative?
Yes, yeah.
Quantitative or qualitative?
Quantitative, right? So you would imagine that you could give surveys that measured all of this, right? And that you could see if these things are correlated, right? Or you could make a regression model, or you could do something quasi-experimental and call a friend, right? We could match groups of students. Yeah, do you have a question? No. Oh, okay. All right, so this is the first one. So this is, again, a motivational theory. Really useful if you're trying to understand persistence, right? Why do students persist in class, in college, in a major, what have you? Second theory, my personal favorite, is expectancy value theory. So again, another psychological theory. And this helps us to understand how students make achievement-related choices. So another really common question we see in STEM education is how do we get students to choose to major in STEM or to go into STEM fields, right? Like how do we, especially groups that we don't see going into STEM at very high rates, how do we get them to do that? So this is a theory that helps us to understand that. So this is the whole thing. Do not write all that down. That's in the paper. But basically, you look at this and you're like, that is horrifying. That is just terrible. So we're gonna extract the part that matters here. So if you look at that part right there, that's the achievement-related choice. So that's the thing we care about, majoring in STEM, wanting to be a doctor, wanting to be an engineer, right? And this tells us that it's predicted by two different things: expectations of success and subjective task value. We'll talk about those things in a second. And there's all this other stuff over here. Basically what all of this is cultural and social antecedents to the other things. I've never seen a study that measures those things, so we're just gonna forget them. And we're gonna use this model. Yeah.
Can you go back a
Sure,
second?
yeah.
So I don't see a role model.
Sorry, what?
A role model. Someone.
Yeah, role model would probably be the socializer beliefs, gender roles, and activity stereotypes. So that would be things like, I don't see any female engineers around me. Maybe I'm not someone that can be an engineer, right? Or, this is my personal experience. My grandpa's an engineer and always mails me weird engineering toys. Maybe he thinks I should be an engineer. But I've never seen that stuff measured very well in a study, right? And if you start thinking about measuring a child's affective memories, I don't even know how to do that. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So my understanding from what you just raised here, the STEM program, one of the objectives is to make more scientists,
So,
or just evaluating the state, we are evaluating the school, or we are pushing the school more scientists.
I think it depends. I think it depends on the researcher, right? So I think there are people that think it's a problem, for example, that there are not many female mechanical engineers. They see it as a problem that they want to fix, right? They want to figure out what would make more girls want to be mechanical engineers and then go do those things in schools, right? I think you could make a pretty compelling argument that we want more diversity in STEM in general. But that's that really reflects the researcher's values and beliefs, right? So I don't think there's a consistent answer. I think it depends on kind of what you would want to know. For me personally, my research is very focused on historically underrepresented groups in STEM because I think, for two reasons. I think STEM is inherently really interesting and beautiful and amazing, and I think more kids should have access to that haven't in the past. But I also think there's a really important economic argument that if we look at children who are growing up in low-income environments, that it's really important that we give them viable pathways to the middle class, and I think STEM is one of them. So, but that's my beliefs, right? Other people might not see it as a problem.
Just
Yes.
adding on to Jessica's argument, there's a lot of like national reports about like we need more STEM workforces. And that's one of the big arguments in the STEM field about we need to nurture more workforces in the STEM area. We're falling behind. The U.S. is typically falling behind to the counterpart of like some of the East Asian countries. The number of the STEM workers are not there. And that's why the whole immigration issues and all that is kind of like, you know, creating each other too.
Did everybody just get the email dealing with doctoral education in the United States?
Yes.
And how our students stack up?
Yes, yes, I did see that. I looked at that report. Do you want to say more about that?
Well,
'Cause I skimmed it.
on
but-
her point,
Yeah.
you know, the Chinese, Koreans, you know, are pushing ahead of us, and even Indians are pushing ahead of us in STEM education. We're following behind, you know.
But that depends on how was that statistics or studies. Is it qualitative or quantitative? Because you know, Chinese and India is huge countries. So the population is high. So is it quantitative, standard, or ranking, or qualitative?
It could be both.
You know, but if you got 1.5 billion people,
Yeah.
and we got 300 million, they don't need to have near as high a percentage doing it to overwhelm us.
I think without the studies in front of us, it's kind of hard. I think you would almost need a presentation on that in itself.
But
It's like,
we've got, all the data was put out in that
Yeah.
email.
Yeah, so I think just to kind of tie all of this together, so people have historically made a national security argument around STEM, and we can debate whether or not, you know, like, is it, you know, politically a good thing to do and all of those types of things. There's an economic competitiveness argument around STEM, and that's been going on basically my entire life. There's an equity argument we can make about STEM, right? The idea that we need to make sure that, you know, the STEM workforce looks like our country and that it's not all pulling from one segment of society. And I find that one very interesting for a couple of reasons. So like if you think about Uber, like Uber was clearly designed by men because women would not create a company where you get in a stranger's car at night, right? I mean, seriously, like, right? Like the first time I heard about Uber, I was like, that's a good way to get murdered.
Yes.
You know? Yeah.
a really interesting one that I saw at AAAS is actually on crash testing.
Yes, that was gonna be my next one.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to say something about that?
Well, sure. It's
Yeah.
that the crash test dummies are almost entirely designed to be weight distributed the way men are, and take impact the way men do.
Yeah.
So instead of like looking at the very different physiological averages between women and the needs, especially like considering pregnancies and other types of things that just, and then if you look at it statistically in terms of outcomes, women are much less likely to survive certain, you know, they control for like head-on crashes, women more likely to die. You know, T-bone crashes, women more likely to die. You know, it's just so there's a lot of evidence in the field that, and then of course, you know, controlling for lots of different variables within that. But yeah, I mean that's telling.
Yeah.
I mean that's outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Medical testing is the same way.
yeah.
Yes.
So yes, thank you. You've all made my case. I think also too, if we look at like race and ethnicity, like I think we're missing so much brilliance when we look at the incredibly low rates of Black and Hispanic STEM majors. I think that's also something to consider when we look at all of this. Which is why I love this theory, because I feel like this gives us a really tangible way of thinking about, why aren't groups from these people from these groups going into STEM fields, right? And this is like the horrifying model that goes like all the way back into like the culture. If you wanted to operationalize that, you could shrink it down to this pretty little model. And so basically, in this theory, if you have an achievement-related choice, like going into STEM or whatever, it's it's often predicted by expectancies of success, which is basically like, do I think I'll be successful at this thing? Which makes sense, right? Like, no one here would be like, yes, I'm gonna major in electrical engineering because I'm gonna drop out, right? Clearly. And then this thing called subjective task value, which is basically, do you like this thing? Does it matter to you? And that's, you can measure that by measuring interest in like math, science, STEM, attainment value, which is basically like, does the thing reflect the parts of you that you think are important? Almost like identity. Utility, like, is this a useful thing? And then cost, and that can be like literal cost, like how much does it cost? It can also be like social cost, like, oh, I can't go to the fraternity party because I'm doing my engineering homework, right? Or especially with younger kids, it's like people will think I'm nerdy because I'm in the robotics club, right? It can be social time costs, actual costs. So this is like a really cool foundation for a quantitative study. And I'm going to show you an example in a minute, so I'm not going to dwell on this one. Last theory is much more of a qualitative study, right? So this is communities of practice. So if you think about STEM, right, and STEM professions and STEM disciplines, you can think about them as communities, right? Communities that have mutual engagement, like people are doing things together, right? Like if you are, faculty member in a college of arts and sciences, you're writing papers, you're going to conferences, like you're doing science with other people, a shared repertoire, so you all kind of do the same things, right? You have the same skills, more or less, right? And that you're working on something together, right? Like a field, like you're all trying to advance the knowledge of the field. So if you were looking at like an engineering student and wanted to think about how an engineering student could become an engineer to join the field of engineering, this is another model, right? So, and this is a very qualitative model, right? You have to go and like ask people, like, what do you do together, you know? What do you do as a field, right? So this is, and I have an example for this one too, so I'm not gonna dwell on this. Okay, so here's an example, because I know I'm running out of time, yeah. All right, so here's an example from an actual study I did that used expectancy value theory. So this is a large quantitative study. So my puzzle was, why do some students enter STEM careers and not others? And that to me, that signals to me this is an achievement related choice. I'm asking a question about a choice, so I'm gonna use expectancy value theory, and I wrote a research question that reflected that. So that's my research question, what factors are related to Black, Hispanic, and white students' STEM career aspirations. Right, so this is very much structured by expectancy value theory. And that's significantly related to is the tell that I'm going to ask a quantitative question. So just to give you a sense of what this would look like, and I'm happy to share like the paper with anyone that would want to read it. I used a lot of data. I used a large scale data set, so I had about 25,000 students. You could do this with a couple thousand, probably about 1,000 even. So if you were looking at across sections of like a large intro chemistry course, this would be appropriate. I used a quantitative approach and I used logistic regression, so just trying to predict certain things. And then I had a bunch of variables, and the part that I wanted to highlight was my outcome variable, my dependent variable, was whether or not people wanted to go into STEM. My independent variables were those exact expectancy value constructs. So I used that theory to structure my study. Okay, so I ran a regression model that looked at whether or not those expectancy value constructs predicted whether or not a student said, yeah, I want to go into STEM. So the theory exactly structured the study I was doing, right? And that would be different than like, you know, how many students wanted to go into STEM, or just asking open-ended questions. So I used the theory to provide a little bit of structure to the questions I asked. And then I controlled for demographic information. Okay, so that's one example. I put the citation there. I did not want to put the results up because they're like very long, boring tables. But basically the results of that study were like, yes, science identity really mattered, just like the theory said it would, right? The other example I wanted to bring up, yes?
Did you bother to ask them if they could identify different occupations that required a STEM
Yes.
degree? And
Sort of. So what the students did is they were asked an open-ended question, what would you like to do? What do you think you'll do when you're 30? And then that was coded into being a STEM or not STEM occupation. using occupational codes from like the Bureau of Labor and Statistics.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, among our black minority students, if how much exposure they even get to STEM growing up. You know, so if you're not exposed to it, if you're not taught it from the time you're a little kid, it's just not in your field of consciousness.
Absolutely, and I did not ask them in this study, but that would be a great idea for a study. I think you would end up in the document.
I just had a question about
Sure.
the quantifying those independent variables. So to get at someone's interest in STEM, like, are you asking them one question or 5
So
questions?
they
or
were
10?
asked between 2 and 5 questions for math and science separately. So it was like, I'm interested in my math class.
Yeah.
I'm interested in when the teacher talks about math. I'm interested in my math textbook. You know, it's very low. And then I used a statistical technique. I used factor analysis to create scale variables.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you get one number for each.
Yeah, so I got like a math interest score.
Okay.
I got a science interest score, so I did that separately from math.
Did you measure how good they perceive themselves to be
Yes.
in those?
Yes, yeah, so they were asked about their expectations of success, so they said like, yeah, it was like, I'm good at my math class, I will succeed in my math class, I know what the teacher wants me to do in my math class, and then the same thing for their science class. And then I constructed an efficacy scale from that. Yeah,
I have
Don.
a simple question. N equal 25,000, where did you get 25,000?
So it's a national data set collected by the National Center for Education Statistics. And it's publicly available.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have some school variables?
No, I did not run any prior nesting, yeah. I could have, but I didn't. I want to be mindful of time, so I'll show you my other example, and then I'll make sure we leave questions at the end. So this is a qualitative example. So this is not one I did, but I did put the citation there. I thought it seemed like it would be of interest to this group, because it's a paper about the goals of STEM faculty and communities of practice in instructional and departmental reform, which seemed relevant. All right, so I grabbed their problem. I'm not going to make you read all of that, but basically they're saying, look, we have a lot of STEM communities of practice at institutions, right? Like this would be a STEM community of practice, like what we're doing right now, right? And we think that they're probably important, right? We think they probably do good things at institutions and in the field and nationally, but we don't really know. So they're asking, how can we design groups like this to really drive instructional reform and engage faculty in this? So that's a very qualitative question, right? That's a how question. You can't answer how with like a p-value, right? You're like 0.05. That's not an answer to how. So this is qualitative. So what these researchers did to answer their qualitative question was they went to 4 different communities of practice that they had identified as successful, and you can read all about how they define that, and they got documents, right? So they got like meeting minutes and those types of things. They observed like 320 hours of different events. They would have come to something like this and sat in the back and watched all the questions. And then they interviewed 112 people across the 4 communities of practice. So it was a very large qualitative study. And they used all of their data to generate an answer to the how. So that model is their how for how these communities of practice ought to be designed. So they're really centered around the philosophy. They have different elements like innovative ideas, resources, materials, they have events, you know, and then they're really structured by personal interactions, right? Just like this, right? Like you guys all come, we all chit chat, Jacqueline talks me into being on another grant, like away we go, you know? That type of thing. And you can read the whole paper, it's actually a really good, interesting paper, but they actually talked about how the theory, the community of practice theory, was not helpful. It did not come up in the results. They thought they would find all of that, and they found something totally different. So you don't see any of those constructs up there. So the theory in this case structured their data collection and then failed to provide any good results, which is kind of interesting. So, and I put that in there to show you that these things are not like, you know, written on stone tablets that were like sent to the College of Education. They're just, you know, theories that may or may not have validity in different contexts. So that is the end of me talking. We can have questions. we can, if you put any poll responses in there, I can pull them up, or we can just answer questions. Yeah.
So self-efficacy theory, that's another one that you didn't mention.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
I mean, I think it's great. And anyone else, like Gina, can also answer. I find these other theories more useful because I think they're a little more complex. So like for me, expectancy value gives you self-efficacy, but it gives you other things as well that I think are also important. Like I personally think identity is incredibly important. And so I like to have that included in this type of work.
The only reason I ask is because
Yeah.
there's a book that just came out a couple of months ago, so it's in the popular press right now,
Okay.
popular literature. So
What was the question?
What I think about self-efficacy theory.
Sir?
What I think about self-efficacy theory.
It's new theory. It's different than this theory.
It's a really old
No,
theory,
yeah,
actually.
it's a long time.
And it gets used a lot, right? Because because one of the things we care a lot about is whether or not students feel confident in STEM. Like, do they have high levels of efficacy? Because that is related to good outcomes. And my answer was that I agree, but I like expectancy value theory more because I think it gives you other variables as well.
And related to that self-efficacy theory, they started to develop a little bit further with like social cognitive career theory, which is often used in the STEM education. Also the concept of like competencies are also coming into STEM education as well as one of the measurement, but they're kind of like hodgepodgey. They can't even define competencies properly right now at this moment. So those are all sort of like just there.
Self-competency?
Just competencies, like competency-based education, the STEM fields, social cognitive career theory, that's often used to see like the academic achievement, the academic kind of development towards like career choices too in STEM, so.
Do you build attribution theory into yours?
Sorry?
Do you build attribution theory into your research?
I'm not super familiar with
Well,
this
okay.
theory, yeah.
It's not as old as Vic Vroom's work on expectancy value theory, but started in the 80s,
Okay.
maybe before. But the idea is that people make attributions to success or failure. They either make internal or external attributions. Those attributions may be stable or they may be unstable. For example, effort is an internal attribution, but it's unstable. Ability is an internal attribution, it's stable. Other people, the role that other people play is an external attribution, but it's stable. Luck is an external attribution, but it's unstable. And so in looking at choices, people may say, well, yeah, it doesn't matter how much I'm going to put forth effort because they take an extrinsic view of causation, and it's going to be other people or dumb luck or, that's going to control my career, not my effort, not my ability. And so that's going to play out. But I have a different question. I did my dissertation on cognitive evaluation theory, the precursor self-determination 40 years ago. Thesis work is published in OBHPD. It's an experimental study and found some problems with this theory, and then they revised it and worked on it. But I've become interested in AI, and now I teach strategy. I'm a macro person now. I transitioned from being a very micro person to a very macro person, and I'm interested in how AI, in my case, influences corporate and competitive level strategies. But I could see students, if you talk about why students should be interested in STEM, AI is going to change the whole nature of the workforce. And if they're not sort of knowledgeable about that, they're going to be left behind. I mean, 50% of the jobs lost in America in the last 5 years have been to technology, not to any foreign competition or immigrants or anything else. It's technology that's replacing jobs.
Yeah,
And
I
that
think
has
that's
been a
also.
huge conversation. I'm a Korean in my country too, connected with like the fourth industrial like revolution and fifth one coming up
Right.
with AI replacing humans and all that stuff. And we were joking about like education will only survive because you can't replace teachers, and we joke about it. But that's one of the things. And that's one of the reasons why the coding education or things like that are really popular now, especially in the K-12, because you need to know how to function with those bases of what AI consists of.
I think that's also really important. Why I don't. It's important to have an equitable STEM workforce because I think those algorithms have a lot of bias in them. Like if you all saw Apple just put out their credit card, and Steve Wozniak, who's one of the founders of Apple, he and his wife applied, and he was approved for 20 times more than she was. And they have the same assets, same accounts, and everything. So clearly there's bias in the algorithm somewhere. And that's why I think it's really important to have a diverse set of people working on those things. But Dom has his hand up.
Oh, so
And
we
then
should
hands.
probably talk at some
Yeah.
point, because NSF has a proposal submission about, what education is going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And so I've written a proposal about what I call the AI lab, essentially. So I'm a chemist. So, I think within 5 years, you're going to be able to walk into a lab and say, hey, Alexa, turn on the hot plate, set it to 50 degrees, do this, do that, do that. So everything will be completely automated. So how does that affect learning outcomes when a lot of you have to think about the decisions you're making? You just don't go in and start tinkering with stuff. So it's and the problem is that I tried to get Google, I tried to get Amazon, and I tried to get Apple to play around. And the problem is getting to the corporate heads of those, because I got as far to say, well, we don't financially support that. I'm like, I'm trying to provide you with money, not the other way around. And they didn't get it. So,
I think
many of you have suggestions on how to get to those guys.
Einstein's quote, when he came to the United States, somebody asked him, oh, Dr. Einstein, you're a great guy. What's the speed of sound? Einstein said, I don't know, I can look that up. And that's what's AI is going to be.
Right.
We're going to be looking at a screen.
Yeah.
We got to provide the questions, though.
Mm-hmm.
And it can provide us
So that's part of
the
the educational
answers.
process. It's coming up with
Yeah.
questions.
I think Hansel has
Yeah, I wanted to shift very quickly back to your original, your first study
Yes.
that was posted there, that was dealing with minority kids. And did you get a chance to capture, or think about capturing a stereotype threat?
No, so the interesting thing I found with that study, without going like into the weeds on everything, is when I ran subgroup models, so I analyzed everybody together, I analyzed the white, black, and Hispanic students separately. That theory didn't work for black and Hispanic students. The constructs that they said should have been predictive, nothing came back as significant, which suggested that that doesn't capture everyone's decision making, which is really interesting.
Really very interesting.
That raises a really good question. So, are certain theories better for exploring certain kinds of questions for certain groups, or?
That's a hard one.
My question related to that. So I've been asked so many times from my students, what major should I go for? Math, science, engineering, or something else? So what is the best answer?
Don't ask the hard questions. Okay, so depends on what they want, right? It's easy to look at where the most job openings are, right? And say, well, this field had the most job openings, therefore you're more likely to get a job in that. You can also say, well, I don't know, you did get 2 C's in calculus, maybe you shouldn't be an engineering major, right? Or maybe you say, you know what, you've got 2 C's in calculus, but I know that your preparation wasn't great, and I think you'd be a fantastic engineer, you're just gonna need to work really hard. So I don't know that there's one right answer to that. I do think though, if we like for example, this theory would tell us that the students that are going to be successful are going to be students with high levels of motivation, high levels of self-determination, right? And that might be a way to foster that conversation.
Do you think the teaching itself is making to apply that thing? The teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're up there, so like for example, using self-determination, competency, perceived competency is one of the factors related to motivation. So if you're a terrible teacher and all of your students are failing every single class and their competency levels are really low, you're probably becoming demotivated in whatever it is you're teaching, right? And we've all had that experience, right? You go to class and you're like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. I'm not learning anything. I hate every second of this, right? Like that is literally why I'm not a chemical engineer. Like, you know. Jesse, do you have anything?
Yeah, I was sorry to take it back
Sure.
to the previous part of the conversation. There was some talking about AI and replacing a bunch of people, and I think there's a lot of assumptions that people make about trends when really, you know, certainly the trend. So when in times there's new technology, say ebooks, right? There's a bunch of adopters, and certainly there's an increasing amount of individuals who are taking on this new technology, and you know, with that comes, you know, ebooks are going to replace books and all of that sort of stuff. Well, at a certain point, you reach a threshold, or sometimes you even have an overshoot, right? Mm-hmm. Where it seems like the trend should continue, but then you have a backlash and it goes back down. So I'm not sure that also, you know, there's a lot of evidence saying, well, it turns out these physical, tangible book thingies are really important to kids and their learning. So maybe that's not, I mean, maybe it's kind of short-sighted thinking that we could just throw all the books in a fire and
Students learn by taking notes.
well, yeah, and also just there's accessibility issues. There's preservation issues. There's lots of different. There's you know. It seems like technology loves to come out with a new technology that replaces the old technology, and somehow books don't really seem to change their technology for hundreds of years. So there's kind of a good consistency for that. So I guess my argument is, you know, just because we see a trend in AI at the moment, I don't know that you can say, you know, in terms of foresight, is that the best for the future? Is that what we're going to see is that what we're going to see in the future? So
yeah, I mean, I like Jessica's personal opinion is that the most compelling argument for all of the STEM stuff is STEM is super interesting and cool. It's a great way of understanding the world around you, and all students should have the ability to choose that if they want to.
sorry,
But yeah,
I didn't mean to get off on.
No, you're fine. Jack.
I just want to bring it back a bit because we're talking more here about results and individual topics, etc. And back to the gist of the talk in terms of methodology and all of this, right? Mm-hmm. Would you say that in any, and we'll use practical word, in a set proposals or whatever, that it is necessary to have a research question and a theoretical framework? I mean, I'll say I prove theorems.
You would know better than me.
I
would know better than me.
I mean, like, Dominic creates molecules, Ryan builds bridges, you know.
Well,
We don't care, sort of thing. So therefore, what's the real value of this whole educational methodological approach to any of this?
So I mean, for example, like on the noise grant, right? Like the true purpose of noise is to give money to people so that they can become teachers, right? But even in that, we had to write in self-determination theory was our theoretical framework for the things we were doing with the teachers and how we were going to study them. So my impression has been that anything kind of education related, NSF really wants a strong theoretical framework that's guiding the intervention and the study. But I mean, they're more successful grant writers than me in here.
No, I would say I've served on some panels for STEM education. So I think it's different, right? If you're writing a proposal for looking at the structure of a more effective structure to survive a hurricane or something, right? Like that's different. But when you're talking STEM education, the panels that I've served on, there's at least always one person who's like, what's their theoretical framework? What theories is based on? What is it? And the rest of the people, but the people, they must be education people or they've worked with education people. Because the non-education people.
No, but I'm asking a deeper question in the sense that why is that important? Why are these people
Yeah.
even there?
So, I
Why
mean,
is this actually important?
I think this stuff matters because it gives you a reason to think your intervention is going to be successful, right? So like in our IUs, we could have just done a bunch of stuff. Like we could have been like, yeah, learning assistance seems like a good idea, and we should probably have a Red Raider Academy to help our, Hispanic students feel welcome, right? We could have done a bunch of stuff, but by using self-determination theory, we were able to have a model for why we thought it worked, right? So we were able to say, okay, we're going to do a Red Raider Academy, and we're going to make these students feel related to one another and to their faculty, right? We're going to make sure we have learning assistance so that their competency feels high to them, right? That they're learning more. And then we're going to make sure that we give the faculty some tools to help make sure that they're building classes where the student autonomy is supported, right? And then we were able to articulate all of that and then build a research piece onto that. That's why I think it matters. Otherwise, I think you can do stuff that has a lot of value, right? And I think you can do a lot of good stuff that is good, that we know is good. Like, I don't think anyone would argue that, like, doing a STEM club is not good, or, like, having mentors for, kids in elementary school who are engineers is, like, of course that's good, of course. But if you think about why it works, this gives us a language for talking about why it might work. And if it doesn't work, we have a language for talking about why it might not work. Yeah.
Well, but isn't that true in every discipline, especially STEM disciplines? I mean, I don't go into a lab and just try to build random molecules. It's based on some theoretical underpinning. Right?
Absolutely.
So there's no point in trying to put a program together unless there's a theoretical underpinning for why you're doing it.
I think that's definitely true. I think education suffers a little bit from the idea that we've all gone to schools. We have like a general sense of what works, Like we've all had good teachers that we knew were good. Like I don't need a model of pedagogy to tell you why this teacher was good or bad, right? But I think this helps us in education to structure and articulate what we're trying to do a little bit more.
And one of the things I can add on to that is that a lot of these theories are actually kind of like more focused on like what to measure in terms of like student perceptions or like the learning outcomes. Often you forgot about like how to design those particular intervention pretty effectively, and that's where like my field is instructional design and technology, where we really talk about instructional theory, instructional design theory, and things like that. And you don't apply those things when you're designing the intervention and link it back to those really important theories, you may be just doing random stuff and then expect to get some of those stuff out there. And I've seen that happening a lot in a lot of research or even like the grant proposal too. And I'm like, you're not designing it in the way to actually expect those things to come out. And that's why having these theories in mind to design your interventions properly to get what you want to get to is also very important. And often that's kind of like overlooked in many ways.
What is the take-home message you all have?
My take-home message?
Yeah.
My take-home message is that when you start asking these STEM education research questions, you should find a theory, like a theory somewhere, to structure what you're asking. And then also that there are lots of lovely education researchers on campus that would love to partner. Yeah.
I just had a question generally about the way studies are structured. So I noticed in the example you gave the expectancy value when you were asking questions about each of the independent variables that are part of that theory or self-determination theory. So there were 3.
Yeah.
So is that the norm? Like you want to look at motivation, like the impact of an intervention on motivation. Would you always look at those 3? Or might you say, like, what I'm really interested in doing in this project is I just want to look at competency and forget everything else. Like competency is so accepted as a contributor to motivation that it's acceptable to just see how competency changes.
Yeah, I think it depends on your research questions, right? So if you're asking a question about competency, of course you should do that. Well, you could also think of a situation where you maybe did an intervention around competency, but you measured the other 2 things just to kind of measure them, to know what they were as well. Yeah.
I mean, you don't always have access to the classroom. You don't always have access to students. So what we do as a researcher, we do have like theories. We just don't like collect only those data. We try to add a little more like this and that there in our instruments to make sure we actually collect extra data, because sometimes even if you actually have a really good plans and if you measure things based on the theories and construct, that doesn't always guarantee really nice like data sets that could come out as a manuscripts or whatsoever. You want to have a backup plan too when you're doing it, because sometimes your data sets are not really usable.
Yeah.
Some students just like randomly like point out their 5-point scales, they're just like too tired, they don't want to answer it, you lose a lot of missing data and all that stuff. Then you lose all that time collecting only that set of data when you could have actually collected more.
Yeah.
So like if you have that mindset, so you probably want to implement a little more towards your research.
So like if you're asking them questions, you might as well.
Yeah,
Okay,
ask
well,
a little
but-
more.
Yeah. Yeah, research with people is
Because
hard.
you don't always have access to
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, and if you do get them, right, then you want to like
Yeah.
squeeze out everything.
Or sometimes if you find a factor that you want to look at, the theory you got that factor from might not be the best fit, but maybe you can find a different theory that's primarily focused on that factor. So there's lots of, I mean, she's 3 today.
Yeah, they're like infinite.
Infinite theories.
Yeah.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for coming. We've got some education folks and some STEM folks here, so if you have additional questions, feel free to stay for a few minutes, exchange contact information. If you guys need help finding someone who can help answer some of these questions, feel free to send me an email or STEMcore an email, and I can hook you up with some of these folks. And I'm happy to help, but thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll
for
send you my slides.
Yes,
So feel free to
perfect.
share those.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Change the slide.
Thank you.